events to raise awareness about the case. But just to begin with my father's personal story, like many Palestinians, his story begins even before his birth. It begins with the year 1948, when his family, both of his parents, were forcibly expelled out of their home in Palestine. His father came from the city of Jaffa, or Jaffa. Actually, both of his parents came from that city. And like hundreds of thousands of other Palestinians, they were forced out of their homes. And my grandfather then went on to live in Gaza, where he worked for the UN, sort of helping with refugees who were expelled. And my father himself was born in Kuwait, and never really felt at home, just like so many other Palestinians who were forcibly expelled and displaced. So he lived in Kuwait for about 8 years, and then they were forced out of there, basically for being Palestinian, being who they are. And then they moved to Egypt, and that's where my mom also grew up. And Egypt, they found it to be a little better, the society was more open, but at the same time there were a lot of restrictions. So when my father was a senior in high school, he had worked, for years. He was very much a bookworm, very, very studious. He actually spent all of his allowance just on books because he was a voracious reader. And like many Palestinians, there's a sort of work ethic that your education will be your freedom, your ticket out of that you're in. So that very much sort of described the way my father was raised and his outlook. But then Sadat came into power that year, and he changed the laws so that Palestinians were restricted to what sort of fields they could study. So even though my father had excelled, his grades were at the top of his class, and he dreamed of becoming a medical doctor, in fact, he couldn't do that. So his father then told him, I've been working hard my whole life, and he sort of offered him his life savings. He said, if you apply to school in the US or the UK, wherever you're accepted, here are my life savings for you. And sure enough, he came to the US to study. He was only 17 years old. And he came, with a lot of dreams. He really saw America as a place where there's freedom of speech, and, beyond just studying and doing well, he also felt this huge moral responsibility to be outspoken on the Palestinian cause, because this was the place where policy was being made. It was the center of power. We were, obviously, the U.S. is Israel's biggest ally, its benefactor financially, and all of that. We all know the role of the U.S. in sustaining and supporting the Israeli occupation. So my father became an activist. He would organize conferences in the U.S., publish magazines, invite different scholars to come here and speak, and really just offer different viewpoints. Well, because of his work and his advocacy, he made some very powerful enemies. And some of those are people, very well-known Islamophobes, people who detest Muslims, but especially Palestinians, whose very existence is dedicated to taking down people like my father simply because they're threatened by their viewpoints, and they're threatened by the fact that there are articulate Palestinians out there who can advocate for their cause. So a man by the name of Stephen Emerson, who calls himself a journalist, but in fact he's an agent for Israel, made a documentary called Jihad in America, a documentary in quotes, not very credible. And this was the same man who, after the Oklahoma City bombing, immediately went on television and said this act was committed by Palestinians and Muslims. So he has no credibility whatsoever. He was also caught trying to pass forged FBI documents to reporters at the AP. So these are just some of the desperate acts and horrific acts that he's taken part of. So in this documentary, he paints my father as a terrorist and a supporter of terrorism. This documentary airs on PBS in 1994, and shortly after, our family's house is raided by the FBI in Tampa, Florida. And after that, a few months later, a protege of Stephen Emerson, a man by the name of Michael Fechter, who's a local newspaper reporter in Tampa, starts publishing hundreds and hundreds of articles just on my father. So this man's beat at the newspaper was strictly just to write about my father in any way, shape, or form to try to connect him to terrorism, whether trying to blame the Oklahoma City bombing on my father or just various, completely disconnected, unrelated acts and incidents, just to try to smear him. So obviously we had a very unusual childhood, really under the glare of not only an agenda-driven journalist like Michael Fechter, who in fact, for years, for a decade, we've been saying this guy basically works for Stephen Emerson, even though he pretended he was a reporter. And then we were vindicated a few years ago when in fact he quit his job at the newspaper and formally started working for Stephen Emerson. So when people accuse us of being conspiracy theories, I mean, come on, half the time these conspiracies are proven true. So anyways, so that's what happened there. He now works for something called the Investigative Project on Terrorism, which is basically Stephen Emerson's outfit devoted strictly to taking down activists like my father and smearing them on the internet mainly. So around the time, a couple of years after our house was raided in Tampa, this was 1995, 2 years later my uncle Mazen was arrested by the FBI, by immigration. He was directly taken to an FBI office and offered a job with the FBI and citizenship if he would basically give them information on my father. So of course he told them, no, I don't have anything to tell you and I'm not going to do that. So they then held him under the use of secret evidence, and remember, this is the Clinton administration, so when people say that all of this started with Bush, I mean, unfortunately that's not entirely true. The Clinton administration wasn't very good on these issues either. So after the Oklahoma City bombing, there's a bill passed in Congress called the 1996 Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act. And this bill, basically, one of the provisions of it allowed for the use of secret evidence. So someone could be arrested, never charged with a single crime, but held indefinitely on the basis of secret evidence that neither he nor his lawyers could see. So basically, as we would say at the time, it was like fighting ghosts. You had no idea what it was that was being said about you. So you felt completely helpless. And the lawyers didn't know either, so how could you prove your innocence when you have... Yes?
So how long could they hold a person?
It was indefinitely. So, yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's crazy. So sure enough, he was held for 3.5 years, and it wasn't until, we really launched a very tough fight against the unconstitutional use of secret evidence. I mean, this is completely contrary to everything we stand for as a country, where we have a Bill of Rights and habeas corpus, the right to confront your accuser. None of that was afforded to my uncle. And I should mention that the use of secret evidence was reserved mainly for use against Arab and Muslim immigrants, with the exception of maybe 1 or 2 people. That was the community that was being targeted with this, this provision. So my father became extremely active on this issue. He was lobbying Congress, going up to Washington every other weekend or week to really lobby Congress and get different civil rights organizations involved on this because it was so blatantly against the Constitution. And he became very successful. He was able to get a bill sponsored to repeal the use of secret evidence, and it was a bipartisan effort, so you even had Republicans on it. And because of his efforts and his success on getting secret evidence repealed, at least by the House, people became even more, compelled or determined to get back at him. And September 11th gave them that opportunity, and to silence him effectively. So after 9/11, and I should actually step back for a minute and talk about the 2000 presidential campaign. So for the Arab and Muslim community, secret evidence was the main issue. You had a lot of high-profile cases, like my uncle Mazen al-Najjar's case, and you had a community that really felt that it was under siege. Like I said, this act was specific.